Photographing a car professionally takes a specific set of skills because positioning, lighting, and capturing any large object that is completely covered in highly reflective surfaces requires a different approach to, say, photographing a pretty tree on a hill. Now, I've been shooting cars for money since about 1990, so I thought in this video I'll give you a nice, quick, and practical guide on one of the most important aspects of car photography, and that is angles. In other words, how you position yourself and your camera relative to the motor vehicle that you're photographing. So what we're going to cover is what I consider to be the 4 best angles to shoot a car from, plus one additional potentially tricky angle, but if you can put in the extra effort, it almost always pays off handsomely. Also, there are 2 things, at least one of which, preferably both, that you do with each photo that you take of a car if you want to get the pro results that you're after. And the first angle we're looking at is probably the most obvious, which is front or rear quarter. Rather than having the car at a, say, 45-degree angle to the camera, we're having the car at more of a 30-degree angle facing the camera. Always with the wheel face towards the camera. Not necessarily completely square on to the camera, but at least turned towards the camera rather than having, the tire facing the camera, unless you're doing a campaign for tires, which you probably aren't. So front or rear quarter with the face of the wheel turned slightly towards camera. And generally I would shoot this about 4 to 5 feet off the ground. So pretty much depending on the height of the car, if you're shooting a Lambo versus, say, a very large SUV, then the height of the vehicle obviously is different. But generally speaking, you want a perspective that is a little bit above, say, roofline. So you get a little bit of a view of the bonnet or of the rear section of the upper rear section of the car, like the boot lid or the hatch lid. But you don't want to be way up looking down on the car, and you don't want to be way down low looking up at the car, because then you end up hiding other parts of the car which constitute its shape and its style, namely the surface area of the bonnet or the surface area of the boot lid or hatch. Now, the second angle is the same, but right down at ground level. And this tends to work better, I find, for a rear quarter shot of the car, looking across the face of the rear wheel with the front wheel turned in a little bit towards camera. So as you'll see in this shot here, I'm shooting across the face of the rear wheel towards the front wheel, and the front wheel is turned with the face towards the camera a little bit, rather than the wheel turned into the body of the car, which would expose the rear section of the tire. This is a great angle when you're going in tight and you're not including all of the rear of the car, like in this shot here, but it also works quite well if you get far enough back to include all of the vehicle and some of its surrounding environment, like these 2 shots here. And the beauty of this shot is it gives the car kind of an imposing look. It tends to, I think, work better with cars that are fairly tall by nature, typically SUVs and saloons. I don't think it works quite so well with very low cars like sports cars, because it hides too much of the vehicle structure and the vehicle shape. Okay, moving on to number 3. This is one that I particularly like, is dead front on or dead rear on. And with this one, I would tend to get a bit higher, say 6 to 7 feet up off the ground, with the wheels dead straight, facing straight ahead. An example of this shot is one that I did of my 981 Boxster out in the countryside. This is one of my favorite shots actually of this car, because it's just simple, it's pure, it's on a straight road. There is very little in the way of background distraction. And to minimize the distraction even further, I eliminated most of the color in this image and just enriched the color more in the headlights. Now, if you shoot a shot like this right down at ground level, for some cars it works. For others, you end up just seeing some headlights, some grille, and underbody components of the car, suspension components, that sort of stuff. Things that tend to be very dark or scuffed or not so attractive. If you do the same from the rear, then you tend to get, predominantly an exhaust system, suspension, control arms, and all this sort of thing, which may or may not be important in the shot. If they're a key component of the car and that's what you're trying to highlight, then fair enough. But if the most attractive parts of the car that you're photographing are its bodywork and its shape, then getting right down at ground level, dead front on or dead rear on might not work. Now, another one that I like, depending again on the shape of the car, is to be dead side on, again with the car's wheels pointing straight ahead, and to shoot this at roughly roof height or a little above or a little below. In this shot here, you can see that I've shot a little bit above the roof line, and this is actually an action shot from a drone. So it's a little bit different to what we're talking about here, but the fundamentals remain the same. It is dead side on, wheels are pointing straight, and we're just slightly above the roof line. With this kind of shot, it's especially important to be conscious of what's behind the car, because if you're photographing the car on a road or on the side of a road, oftentimes there'll be foliage or other things directly on the other side of the car, behind the car, like trees or guideposts on the side of the road, this sort of stuff, and they'll be quite close to the car, and they may not be far enough away for you to blur out with a wide aperture. So you want to be conscious of that and make sure you have a nice clean background on the other side of the vehicle. It's a bit different to when you're photographing a car off the side of the road and you have the roadway going away from you into the distance. That it is typically much further away, and there are no obstructions in the middle of the road, of course, because it's a roadway. Yes, there'll be trees on the side of the road perhaps, but not directly behind the vehicle on the roadway itself. So you've got a nice clear area of empty space behind the vehicle or in front of the vehicle, depending on which angle you're shooting from, to blur out with a nice wide aperture. Ideally, if you can, for this kind of shot, in fact, for a lot of car shots, it's really nice if you can get the car on a crest of some kind where you have your background well and truly far away and can blur it out nicely, or you have no background at all. Okay, so we basically covered 4 angles. Some of them are sort of, 2 up. You got front or rear quarter, roughly 4 to 5 feet off the ground. Front or rear quarter, again, that's exactly the same angle, but right down at ground level, depending on the vehicle. And like I said, with taller vehicles, that tends to work better. Dead front or rear on, which you would shoot typically 6 to 7 feet up so you can look down onto the bonnet or onto the boot lid, trunk lid, hatchback, whatever, down to the vehicle. And you also, by getting up higher like that, you get a view of the roadway receding off into the distance. If you do this shot down very low, yes, it can work depending on the vehicle and depending on what you're trying to showcase. But if you get down very low, you don't see the surrounding environment. You don't get a sense of place where the car is in the image. Whereas if you're up high, especially if you've got the car in the middle of the road, and you can get up a bit higher and look down on it, then you get this great perspective of the road receding in the distance. I love that kind of shot. And the 4th one was dead profile, preferably at roof height or a little above or a little below, dead side on with the wheels straight. And the front and rear ones was with the wheels straight as well, of course. Okay, now I mentioned that there was a bonus potentially tricky or challenging image that you can try, and it almost always pays off handsomely if you can pull it off, and that is an overhead shot. Now, there are a few ways you can do this. Obviously, the easy way is with a drone, and really you want a drone that's got, like the DJI Air 3 or the DJI Mavic Pro, where you've got multiple focal lengths, one of which is on the longer side. Most drones tend to have, if they only have one lens, have a very wide lens, and unless you're getting a wide environmental shot that includes a fair bit of the surrounding area, it's going to distort the car. If you get too close to the vehicle, it's going to distort it too much. In terms of the angles, I think when you're shooting overhead, rather than go straight down, a straight down shot can be quite interesting. And one of my favorite thumbnails on my channel is the straight down shot of the 981 Boxster when I compared the 981 with the 911 992 that I rented for a weekend. That shot kind of works. But I think for the most part, when you're shooting down onto a vehicle, you want to be somewhere at either 45 degrees looking down into the vehicle, somewhere between 45 and 90. I don't think you want to be too shallow like this, look into the vehicle too shallow, although that can still work. But to get the full effect of the overhead look, I think it's good to be at 45, somewhere between 45 and straight down on the car. One of the toughest shots that I got many, many years ago was in Australia, the EB Falcon Cobra limited edition. But I remember that I wanted to get an overhead shot of that car because of the stripe that ran down the length of the vehicle. And the only way I could do that where we were shooting, which was down at the loading docks of the port area in Melbourne, in Port Melbourne, was to climb up one of those huge electricity pylons and brace myself up there shooting down onto the vehicle. And I remember it was quite a windy day, and it wasn't easy to get the first section up one of the legs of this pylon because there's no ladders, there's no way to, they don't want you to climb up these things, but I managed to scramble up. I was young and fit, camera strapped over my neck, and I crawled up quite a bit actually because I wanted to shoot with a long lens, compress the car from up high from sort of like a rear 3/4 angle, again about 30 degrees to the camera like I was saying, and at around about somewhere between probably 50, 60 degrees down onto the vehicle. And I remember how windy and how surprised I was by how much this thing was moving as I was trying to take this photo. So I'm sort of bracing with my left arm on this pylon, standing on one of the side rails, holding my camera with a 70-210, I think it was, on my Nikon F3, shooting down onto this cobra. And I took so many shots because I think I was shooting Velvia. I just went on a Velvia fix there for a while, but shooting on this car with not a very fast lens, and because I had a fairly slow shutter speed, I think I took like 3 rolls of film just on this one shot to nail the shot. And only a couple of them were sharp, but it looked great and it was definitely worth it. It's much easier these days with digital cameras, fast sensors, fast lenses, or drones, being able to shoot down with a drone. But if you can nail a good overhead shot of a car, it's always a great look. Now, I mentioned 2 things that you should always try and do with every car photo that you take, and I'm wondering if you picked them up. The first one is to shoot with a focal length that's somewhere between 50 and 200 mil, ideally. Pretty much anything from 50 millimeters and up is great for shooting cars. Obviously, the high focal length you go, the further away you got to get from the car unless you're shooting, close-up sections of the vehicle. So that's the first one. Now, 50 to 200 is around about 30 to 135 in APS-C. It's about 25 to 100 in Micro Four Thirds format. And in 645, like the Hasselblad X2D that I'm using, it's between 65 and 255 millimeters. I also like to shoot, though, at longer focal lengths, get further away and really bring the background in, blur out the background, compress everything, and bring it all together with a nice, mushy, blurred out background. So, I've shot cars up to probably 300, maybe even 400 mil, but you've got to get a fair way back, and you've got to make sure that you've got someone there to keep an eye on your gear if you're walking that far away, or at least the vehicle is away from traffic and secure. Now, the reason why we go with 50 mil and above is because anything much lower than 50 mil tends to introduce distortion, which you really don't want with a motor vehicle. Designers have gone to great lengths to make a vehicle look a certain way to the human eye. And once you start shooting with wider focal lengths, say pretty much anything 35 mil and below, it starts to distort the vehicle, especially if you try to fill the frame or close to fill the frame with the car. It just distorts the car and makes sections of it look much bigger than they are, and other parts that are further away from the lens smaller than what they are. This is why shooting with something like 70, 80 to 100 mil is really nice for a car. One of the best lenses I ever shot cars with was the Sigma 105 f1.4. That was awesome shooting with that lens. Super fast, beautifully sharp, perfect focal length. The only time I would shoot a car with a lens wider than 50 mil really is if it's an environmental shot where what I'm capturing is the environment that the car is in and the car is providing the supporting role. Then I'm fine with shooting any focal length. It doesn't matter how wide it is. The only thing I would say is try and keep the vehicle away from the edges of the frame. Anything bumped up to the edges of the frame is going to stretch and it's going to distort the vehicle. Okay, so that was the first thing, focal length. 50 to 200 or 50 and above, really. But 50 to 150 is a really good working range to photograph cars, every part of the car. The second thing is to use a CPL filter, a circular polarizing linear filter, to minimize or eliminate reflections on at least one surface plane of the car, to minimize glare where you've got perhaps direct sunlight creating a hot spot on the windscreen or a piece of panel or side glass. Circular polarizing filter is great for minimizing that, but also it allows the color of the paintwork to punch through those reflections and that glare and create a beautifully rich look on the motor vehicle. You don't realize how much of a difference a CPL filter can make to the look of your photos until you use one and start rotating it and seeing just how directly and immediately it impacts the color saturation, the richness, and the reflections and the glare coming off the vehicle and the surrounding environment too. Anyway, I hope this was useful. If it was, please do give it a thumbs up. and subscribe if you can. And I hope to see you in the next one. Bye for now.